You spent years studying people who gamble when they have almost nothing. What did that teach you about human nature that you didn't learn or you couldn't have learned any other way?
Um, well, it's a great question. I think it's a big question as well. I think that you're at the end. To put it in perspective, there are lots of people out there who do not gamble. There's lots of people who live in societies where gambling happens and they don't participate in gambling. There are also sort of cultures and societies where gambling was not part of what people did. Often those people were kind of on the margins of capitalism or other kind of larger systems of economy, and uh, and therefore I was always really interested in people who gamble who didn't gamble before, to tell us a little bit about what is really human nature and what isn't human nature, and what's just actually just kind of economic and cultural circumstances. And so I think, so the short answer to that question is that I don't think there is a human nature to gamble, like to think about things in gambling terms, but that gambling is so important to the way that our present society, in the in the larger kind of global sense, um, uh, how it thinks about itself, that it thinks about gambling as being natural. So the big kind of deceit in all of this is the idea that gambling is part of human nature and part of the way that humans have to think about the world, but it isn't. But it feels natural, and that's because it is at the absolute core of how we understand how we're supposed to interact with each other on a kind of normal and everyday kind of basis. And so the people who I worked with previously who didn't gamble and then picked up gambling during colonial period when money came along, etc., those people uh, explicitly were attempting to kind of figure out and understand a new economic system that they were coming to grips with. And so gambling tells us that it's human nature to try and find a way to play, and through that play think about the wider circumstances they live in and how they can kind of be successful within it.
I think it's fascinating that yes, you can look at it both ways. Where it is about individuals and human beings and how they kind of choose to kind of alchemize their environment, but it also says a lot about the society that they live in. So I think it's very interesting to look at the study that you did, the fieldwork study you did in Papua New Guinea, or currently doing ongoing. Could you talk to me about like the research and kind of like what started you on that indigenous mathematic path? And can you tell me more about this and how the mathematics lead you to gambling?
Yes, so Papua New Guinea is a super interesting place, but it's not a place that I was super interested in before I started. So I did an undergraduate, and it was in anthropology, uh, but I never studied anything to do with numbers or thing. And I was kind of a maths geek at school. And although I never pursued it for A level, I all did kind of humanities subjects. I was just kind of really driven to try and understand the way that the world works. And so I thought that the best way to do that would be to do kind of human oriented subjects. And so, but I had a little, I've got a little soft spot for maths in it. And so it kind of occurred to me that I had done no mathematics. I'd never learned anything about the way that maths is done differently in different places. And it sounds kind of silly to say that, oh, maths is different. There's a universality to the way that numbers work, right? But uh, our base numbers, the numbers that we consider to be important, the way that we kind of conceptualize the maths that we do, like the fact that we count bones and things as individual units rather than as kind of parts of a wider totality, like that kind of larger scaffolding that goes around mathematics that I learned about after I started looking into it. That obviously makes a huge difference to the way that people think about the world, because there's very little that's more fundamental to us than the way that we count, right? And so um, I sort of decided I wanted to do this, working in a cocktail bar. I was going to do a master's. I wanted to go to Iraq. That was not looking good by that point, and worse over that summer. And so I went to my supervisor and I said, I want to do something on maths. And he he put me, sent me towards a couple of books, one of which was based in Papua New Guinea, and was by a man called a brilliant man called Yadra Mimica, called Intimations of Infinity, that was all about how people think with number differently in Papua New Guinea. Amazing, written in 1988. Uh, Definitely not what I would find in Papua New Guinea again. So it became really clear to me then that I needed to do one of two things to make it kind of contemporary and relevant, which is find a place where um, maths, indigenous mathematics, and for want of a better term, Western mathematics meet. And there was kind of two obvious options for that. One of which was maths education in schools, and the other thing I found out in the time whilst I was looking for ways that people engage with mathematics in Papua New Guinea is through gambling. And I was 22 or 23, and the idea of sitting in a classroom with kids, which is not quite as appealing as sitting underneath houses playing cards with random people.
And okay, tell me more about that kind of study then, or kind of like what you found when you started staying underneath the kind of houses playing cards. How did gambling function differently to what we view of it as in the West?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are kind of structural similarities, and then there are kind of sociocultural, not well, differences and sociocultural differences. The big kind of structural difference is that so gambling is very often made illegal in situations of colonization or kind of politically fraught situations, because if you think about it, gambling is a place where uh, people gather secretly, or people gather and get rowdy and get interested. So there's two kind of approaches you can take to that. One is you can allow it as a kind of release valve, or you can try and prevent it, because it potentially kind of disempowers you. Now, in a colonial situation, it's particularly important to suppress gambling, in part because those people, often, people of a different skin color, or people who don't have the same values as the colonizer, they are being given money for the first time. Or they're not giving it, they're working for wage work, or they're working for goods, etc. And that is a powerful way of kind of structuring your relationship between yourself, between you as colonizer and the colonized, right? So they have to work for you in order to get their money. Well, gambling doesn't, it messes up that flow, right? It redistributes goods amongst all different kinds of people. And it does it in a way that kind of allows people to negotiate with boundaries, and kind of different power structures in society, right? So um, in Papua New Guinea, you're talking about people who young people working as laborers, making money and wealth that kind of absolutely eclipsed and took sort of overtook their kind of elders and forebears who did have control over society. So they needed to find, but those young men, they needed to get married, and they needed to be part of the world. So what did they do? They came back with chests full of goods, and then they would gamble them with the other people in the village, and they would somehow lose, right? And often they would lose to people who would then have power to give them permission to marry. And so these so gambling became for people in Papua New Guinea a way of kind of negotiating and playing with this new economy, and doing so in a way that allowed them to include other people, but also just to kind of explore what money does and what other kinds of valuable are doing. You've got to think that this is like really peripheral. These goods, these axe heads, these bush knives, this oil, this soap, all this stuff's new. Where is it coming from? How is it made? Why do these people who just came here have control over these things? And why do they insist on using this thing called money? And why do they insist on taking taxes from us in this thing called money that makes us have to then work for them, right? So it's massively confusing, and they're not really being given any kind of way of having any kind of equal stake in this system, right? And so people are trying to find ways of exploring exploring what's possible and how they can act in a way that allows them to be successful in this new kind of economy. So that's what was happening, but because it was illegal, it was happening secretly underground with games that were invented by Papua New Guineans and then kind of adapted and had this kind of interesting genealogy into what we see today. So there's two, as I said at the beginning, there are two differences. One of them is kind of socio-cultural. That's what I'm talking about there. The other one is kind of structural, which is that there's no house edge to most of these games, right? I'm not a I've got no specific advantage because I own the because I deal in the cards, right? And so as a result of that, it makes it possible for people to kind of have a more kind of fair distribution of the wins and losses across the populace. And then when gambling starts to come in Papua New Guinea, then you've got horse races, then you've got they call them pokies, they're slot machines, all of these things that have house edges that then make it possible to exploit this new interest that people have in gambling and turn it into the kind of reliable, capital enhancing, extractive operation that it is in all places these days.
I think that point is very important because I think that's what initially drew me to this conversation was that your study in Papua New Guinea was very kind of like new and fresh and kind of almost prophetic in terms of what it led to what we see happening in the West. And I think that's what is so interesting to me because I feel like a generation is that is figuring out itself out is kind of coming to the same conclusion as they did in Papua New Guinea that you can change your environment simply by kind of using the system to kind of flip it around. But that system itself is corrupt. That system itself isn't built to kind of help you. And in your study, you talked about you kind of drew a line between what you found in Papua New Guinea's gambling systems and kind of apps like Polymarket or Kashi. Can you walk me through that for me, please?